Good morning, everyone. I'm Avery Irons, the Associate for Technical Assistance at the New York State Youth Justice Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for day 2 of Are the Kids All Right? COVID-19 in Youth. We are excited today to bring you this conversation of our Justice Systems 1 panel. It's an incredibly urgent and timely conversation. We have wonderful people leading it for us. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. I and my colleagues, Alicia and Samaria, will start things off with just a bit of housekeeping. I'll start by saying, if you have any issues with the tech side of this conversation, please email us directly at youthjustice@albany.edu. That link should be appearing right now in the chat box. And with that, I will turn it over to Alicia Gagnon.
Hello, good morning. My name is Alicia Gagnon, and I am a research assistant at the Youth Justice Institute. Thank you again for joining us. As our presenters today are speaking, you are welcome to ask questions in the Q&A section or in the Facebook comments as we go along. We should have some time at the end of the session today for these questions, but in case we do not get to all of them, we are keeping track of them, and we'll do our best after the conclusion of the forum to answer the remaining questions. Today, we have Angelique McAlpine of Drawing Impact, providing live digital visual note-taking. Her screen is projecting alongside the panelists' videos. You can adjust the relative size of the panelists' videos and Angelique's drawings by shifting the vertical sliding bar to the left or the right to suit your preference. Please feel free to try that right now. This session and all of our sessions are being recorded and will be available to watch at a later point. Now, turning it over to Samaria.
Hi everyone, my name is Samaria. I'm a Youth Justice Institute scholar. We would like to invite you all to engage with your fellow attendees throughout the week and afterwards on our online Padlet board, which we'll link in the chat. This is a virtual bulletin board intended to serve as a collaboration and networking space, similar to at a professional in-person conference. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Giza Lopez, the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute, to present some opening remarks as we begin this session.
Hello, thank you so much, Samaria. If you're new to this event, welcome. If you joined us in yesterday's discussions, welcome back to the New York State Youth Justice Institute's Forum on COVID-19 and Youth. My name is Giza Lopez, and I am the Executive Director of the YJI. This forum is designed to bring together insights from multiple disciplines and from diverse professional fields to discuss 3 big questions. 1, what are the current impacts of the pandemic on youth? 2, what are the foreseeable impacts of this crisis on this population long-term? And 3, what practice and policy innovations have emerged out of this situation that might lend themselves to sustainable efforts moving forward? While children, teens, and young adults are not the face of this crisis, a recent report by the United Nations points out that they risk being among its biggest victims. Everywhere, the report states, youth are being affected, especially by the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. Just in the past few months, an entire generation of children have had their education upended. Teens considering college this fall might have to change their plans to help unemployed parents at home. Young adults graduating college now face a dire economic crisis. We know from previous health emergencies that children are at heightened risk of exploitation, violence, and abuse when schools are closed, when social services are interrupted, and when movement is restricted. And throughout all of this, members of minority groups are most seriously affected. This is, of course, a universal crisis, and for many, the impact will be lifelong. It is imperative that we try and assess the long-term consequences the situation may have over the life course of youth, and especially youth involved in the justice system. Yet, as the old maxim says, necessity is the mother of invention. Now, more than ever, we're offered the opportunity to rise to the occasion and engage creatively in problem solving. Just think about the 10-year-old girl in California who created a plastic curtain designed to hug her grandparents while keeping them safe from infection. Or the teen in Seattle whose COVID tracking website has become a crucial resource worldwide. New policies and practices are emerging everywhere. It's in our interest to learn about them and assess their efficacy and sustainability. As much of the world begins to reopen, we invite you to collectively imagine with us the future of youth and justice post-COVID. As we do so, let's remain critical. Let's avoid romanticizing the past. The world as we knew it pre-pandemic was far from perfect. Even amidst a dystopian worldwide crisis, racism in the justice system has still found a way to rear its head, as the events in Minnesota and nationwide in the past few days made crystal clear. Let us work to ensure that the new normal we are aspiring to achieve, whatever that is, doesn't bring with it the ugly vestiges of centuries past. We are absolutely honored to have a stellar roster of experts lead these discussions over the next few days and help us get closer to answers that will guide our collective work moving forward. My many, many thanks to the panelists, to the moderators, and to our plenary and keynote speakers, Michael Umpierre and Professor John Powell, who will be guiding us in exploring these questions between now and Friday. This pandemic has made us all acutely aware of how connected we all are in the world. If a crisis like this can ever have a silver lining, I would offer that this pandemic has instilled in most of us a deep sense of collective responsibility and has illustrated the critical role that data can play in policymaking. For that reason, in organizing the event, we wanted to go beyond the local and weave together national and global expertise in these areas to capitalize on what we can learn from each other. We're pleased to see that this effort has translated into an equally diverse audience here today. Many of you come from local and state governments all over the country, as well as universities, nonprofits, and research centers from near and far. Thank you very, very much for being here on Zoom with us today. It only remains for me to thank the staff and scholars of the YJI, and especially Alicia Gagnon, Avery Irons, and Brian Rainey. Without you guys, this would not be possible. Your passion and commitment to the YJI inspire me every day. The YJI results from a partnership between the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, and SUNY Albany. My thanks to the YJI's Executive Board and to the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group for their unwavering support for the Institute. My thanks also to SUNY Distinguished Professors and former Deans of the School of Criminal Justice, Bill Pridemore and Alan Lizotte, Professor Megan Kurlichek at Penn State, staff of the Division for Research at SUNY Albany, and Diane Serpino from the Tau Foundation for all their help. Let's get started. While yesterday's panels, for those of you who were with us, focused on homes and communities, today we're shifting gears to justice systems. This pandemic has most certainly impacted every institution in our global society, and the criminal and juvenile justice systems are, of course, no exception. Confronted by the enormity of this crisis, these systems had to adapt age-old practices and shed long-held beliefs. As we slowly begin to imagine this post-COVID world, we have an opportunity to go back to the drawing board. At the front and center of that process should be, I propose, an earnest desire to tackle institutionalized racism head-on and to bring in legitimately the voices of all minority groups, not only youth of color, but those with behavioral health needs, LGBTQI youth, youth with disabilities, and immigrant youth. Luckily, we're joined today by an incredible group of experts who can show us the path forward. It is my pleasure to introduce them now. AMORE Alvarenga is the inaugural Juvenile Justice Coordinator for the New York City Law Department Family Court Division, where she produces a variety of practice-enhancing resources and recommendations aimed at improving outcomes for youth and communities. Her top priority is identifying and developing strategies to support vulnerable populations, including commercially sexually exploited children, crossover youth, girls, and LGBTQ+ youth. As a 2019 Youth Justice Leadership Institute Fellow, AMORE launched the Family Court Division Pride Initiative, FCD Pride, a trauma and resiliency-informed systems change to support, empower, and affirm LGBTQ+ youth and communities who come into contact with the system. Welcome to the panel, AMORE. Judge Stephen TESKE is the Chief Judge of the Juvenile Court of Clayton County, Georgia. He was appointed Juvenile Court Judge in 1999 and also serves as a Superior Court Judge by designation. The Governor of Georgia has appointed him to the Children and Youth Coordinating Council, Governor's Office for Children and Families, DJJ Judicial Advisory Council, JDAI Statewide Steering Committee, Georgia Commission on Family Violence, and the Georgia Criminal Justice Reform Commission. Judge TESKE is the 2018 recipient of the Juvenile Law Center Leadership Prize Award. Welcome, Judge TESKE. We also have as a panelist with us, DINA THOMPSON, who is the Executive Director and the founding member of Erie County Restorative Justice Coalition in New York, and serves as an adjunct professor of restorative practice at the University at Buffalo in the Department of Social Work. She has trained over 40 schools and hundreds of community members in restorative practices. Through collaboration with other community-based organizations, DINA supports 4 regional practice sessions for restorative justice practitioners in partnership with the Center for Resolution and Justice, has helped facilitate restorative conferencing in family court. It is a pleasure to have you, DINA. And to orchestrate the voices of these amazing panelists, we have an equally incredible moderator, Dr. Nina ALEDORT. Dr. ALEDORT is the Deputy Commissioner of the Division of Youth Development and Partnerships for Success with the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. Dr. ALEDORT focuses on key policy challenges at the intersection of child welfare, juvenile justice, child sex trafficking, and runaway and homeless youth, and on disparate impacts. She is a founding co-chair of the New York State Partnership for Youth Justice and an author of several peer-reviewed articles. Dr. ALEDORT has also presented nationally and internationally. It is a wonderful opportunity to have you here. Dr. ALEDORT, please take it away.
Thank you, Giza, for the introductions, and good morning, everybody. This is a very exciting opportunity to have this conversation. And I just want to take a moment to really recognize that it would be impossible to start this conversation without recognizing the moment we are in. The country is in upheaval with hurt, anger, and fear around injustice, and there is anxiety and uncertain outcomes for the communities most impacted, particularly communities of color, and most impacted by both the unrest and COVID. I want to invite all of us to take a moment to honor in our own way all the men and women, both young and old, who have been harmed or killed, particularly Black men and women, many of whose names are known to us, and sadly, many whose names are unknown. And also to honor all of those who are peacefully and powerfully calling the system to task. So I want to move us forward and also recognize that this is an historic moment, and one that will either galvanize us for real change to root out the vestiges of the entrenched and institutionalized racism, or we will fail again to take the bold steps that are required to move us toward healing and collective, equitable safety, prosperity, and abundance. I am hopeful that we can really seize the moment and worried that we may miss the boat once again. Across the nation, those who are routinely in our youth justice systems are overwhelmingly youth who are othered or marginalized across one or many axes: boys and young men of color, a growing population of underserved, underrecognized girls and young women of color, gay, lesbian, bisexual youth, youth who are gender nonconforming and transgender, atypical learners, and all young people who come into our system of youth justice have often complex histories of trauma and failures by the systems designed to meet the needs of youth in their communities, not necessarily the failures of youth to meet those expectations. An amazing colleague of mine, Jim Zarniak, who may be on today, once said to me, "Every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets." So as a policymaker, and one of the adults responsible for designing these systems, that statement was clarifying, crystallizing, and frankly horrifying. It really became a critical lens, and one that I would invite us all to put on as I moved forward. Systems aren't just there, right? They are created, they are reified, they're recreated, and they're shored up by people. And people who generally intend to do good things for vulnerable people, but often for many, many complicated reasons, those systems deepen the poor outcomes for the exact group that they're intended to serve. So as we move to this morning's panel of powerhouse thinkers and doers, these are people who see the system as the unit of intervention, not just the youth and parents, and who bring that lens of system reform to their daily work. When we put this panel together about 6 weeks ago, the world was in a different place. I cannot imagine a better group of people to discuss not only how the pandemic has impacted youth justice systems and also now the civil moment that we are in, but how we can design it for the outcomes we want, not just for the outcomes that we're getting. So with that, I'm going to ask the first question of our panel. So, COVID has really given lie to any fiction that there are not institutional systemic reasons for inequitable outcomes. So from your vantage point, what opportunities, strategies, or knowledge have surfaced around equity in the space of youth justice? And again, the equity is racial, ethnic, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, socioeconomic status, very, very wide reading of equity. And what changes have you implemented in the last 3 months that have garnered you good outcomes, and why? I'm going to go on mute and AMORE, do you want to start, or?
Sure, I can start it off. Thank you for that really thoughtful and well articulated introduction about the urgency of this conversation. And I want to start off by giving some context as to what I would like to answer to that question. So the landscape of youth justice in New York City has been transforming towards implementing evidence-based, community-oriented interventions to effectively meet the needs of youth. And part of this change was facilitated by the Raise the Age legislation, which allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to be prosecuted in family court and have access to those services. So this change in law exemplifies some of our shifts in understanding about youth needs and interventions that effectively promote community safety. So our practice has been for example, evolving to create more trauma and resiliency informed policies and practices, to increase our diversion practice, to enhance our restorative responses, and to actively address equity issues around race and gender. Much of this work has been driven by an onboarding of multidisciplinary experts like diversion coordinators, resource specialists, victim advocates, a youth advocate, and myself. And really, our work has been around building out relationships with community-oriented organizations, actively engaging with community members to understand their needs and trends that they're seeing and what they want out of our system. So this has really laid the foundation for our responsivity in this moment. There's not a single aspect of life that has not been impacted by COVID-19, especially for youth living in its epicenter. This moment, that stress of COVID-19 will result in significant trauma for many youth and their communities, whether it's the toxic stress of economic instability, the toxic stress of grieving family members, teachers, mentors, and stabilizing institutions. All this coupled with the current protests for justice that are going around across the nation, actively seeking for responsivity to this pain. So truly, we know that both of these are not unrelated, and we know that they're disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities. So our job is to promote community safety through the well-being of youth, right? So, and their communities. So we have to be responsive to this moment and holistic. That being said, equity must be centralized in our responses. When attempting to meet our goal of issuing outcomes that are in the best interest for the child, we also have to understand the disparities that are impacting Black and Brown communities. And we also have to, so part of our work in doing and responding to COVID-19, when the pandemic when the shelter in place first took an effect, we conducted an unprompted review of all youth in detention, and were able to reduce this detention and secure population by 66%. And we were also able to reduce the population in non-secure detention by 53%. This in-depth review really centralized the question, what needs to happen for youth to safely be in the community? And we took the steps to make that happen. We have really highly relied on our community-oriented partnerships to meet this goal of providing youth the resources they need to get through the stress of this moment. Without our community partnerships, which have largely been driven by our diversion team, who have maintained constant communication and contact with our partners to understand their capacity, without that work, we would not have been able to achieve the release of so many youth in detention. And we are continuing to review the detention population to ensure that youth can stay in community. This is also another partnership, an area in which we have shifted to really minimize contact with the system, is a collaboration between the Department of Probation, the Law Department, and the Police Department to minimize exposure by interviewing youth who have been arrested at the precinct rather than having to be transferred to a detention place. If you think about that, that's less time in handcuffs, less time in a cop car, less time in transportation. That's less exposure to COVID-19. And it is also less exposure to the potentially traumatizing circumstances that I just described. So those are some of the concrete ways that we've taken steps to respond to this moment. And again, our community organizations have been really at the central collaboration in this work.
Thank you so much. Judge TESKE?
AMORE, that was a great opening response, well structured and a great delivery. And I would like to kind of use that as a because it's so great as a kind of a platform and diving board to jump into this pool. And, the question starts off, at your vantage point. So, I'm a jurist in a judicial system, okay? And so from that vantage point, and after 21 years, or come July 1st, 21 years sitting on the bench, the one thing that I've learned that I think is really relevant to what AMORE was saying, okay, system creates the outcomes, all right? Think about this for a moment. In all my travels across the country, I have yet to meet somebody who does not care about kids, okay? In fact, the vast majority I've met have a tremendous passion for children, okay? They want to do right with kids and they want to improve their situation. But here's the problem. If, it doesn't matter how good our heart is, it doesn't matter how good our head is, but if we're working in a broken system, we will still make broken decisions that will lead to broken outcomes. And that's why focusing on the system is so important. So let me do what she did, AMORE, and that is structure it this way, put it in context, and I'll be short about it. And that is, back when I took the bench in '99, and we got to remember, I think we already, as a baseline, understand and accept, at least I think the vast majority is that our justice systems are rife with inequities of all kinds, okay? And I noticed this the first moment that I took the bench in '99, because, I saw the faces of those most frequently coming to court and realizing that most of these faces were poor and of darker complexion than me. And, I also discovered with the help of data gurus, because that interested me, that sparked, like, what's going on here? And, so I said, well, let's take a look at what's going on, who's coming in, let's get a profile. And so my data gurus there with the county in Clayton, to try to find out what are the reasons, why are there so many people of color, kids of color, that are disproportionately represented in my justice system. And it was associated to a combination of their poor social and economic circumstances, okay, and systemic racial biases within the system itself and the way that the system is operating. So anyway, I embarked on a path to correct these disparities and have reduced the detention, of Black youth, as many of you know, by 70%, and reduction of Black youth committed to this state by 62% as of today. And yet it's important to understand that in doing that without increasing the crime rate. All right. And in fact, on the contrary, our juvenile crime filings are down 80% in Clayton County. And, which for me shows how much our system was racially biased in the first place. So notwithstanding these good numbers, folks, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought for me a sharper focus more than ever before on the needs of our poor citizens, and therefore a need to call to action, a collective bipartisan group that takes what we do know as fact, empirically study these facts to recommend policies to improve the economic and social circumstances of this population. See, folks, I'm convinced that more can be done, even in my county. These numbers I gave you, no matter how impressive they are, I came to realize because of this pandemic, that I can't rest my laurels on this number. I could have done better, okay? And I'll speak to that in just a moment. So let me just move on quickly and conclude my response, with what I have done, which is part of the question, okay, that have resulted in good outcomes that has sharpened as a result of sharpening my focus, all right? For example, as soon as our Chief Justice declared a statewide judicial emergency, I immediately revised the admission criteria to detention, focusing predominantly on violent felony offenses, okay? I created a 3-person evaluation team to review the youth that were currently in detention at the time of the shutdown, so to speak, using these revised admission criteria to determine which youth may be released to alternatives to detention. And this resulted in a 95% of my detained population being released. And I want to point something out. To this day, not a single one of them have disrupted or reoffended. And that's extremely important because it begs the question, should I have allowed them in the first place? Now, keep in mind, my average daily detention population before I introduced reforms was 62 in a 60-bed facility. Today, it's 15. But right now, I only have 2 kids in detention, all right? So it begs the question, maybe my average daily detention population should be maybe 2 to 4 instead of 15 daily. That's where I'm going with this. So we created, I created this weekly video. So those kids who are still in detention, like for example, this afternoon at 1:30, I'm gonna meet with those 2 kids by Zoom with their lawyer, their public defender, with the prosecutor, with staff. And to keep an eye, I wanna reassure them, that they're not forgotten. I want to make sure that we're moving the case. How can we get this case going and get this kid out? All right. I want to make sure the conditions of confinement are well. I want to connect with the parent because the parents are online as well. And here's the other thing, ladies and gentlemen, even some of the violent offenses, I've released some of them because in talking to these kids and getting to know these kids, okay, I have come to realize that the violent offense may not be indicative that they have a proclivity to be violent, that they're not really violent kids, all right? And so with that said, let me just take a look at my notes because I'm coming to the end here. Probation meets weekly with the kids by video, all right? They do it according to risk level. We have a multidisciplinary detention review. We've gone virtual with that, so we didn't stop that. So the kids who do get detained on a violent offense, this multidisciplinary panel still meets with the parents, with the schools, so everyone on there, the schools, social services, so forth, to try to develop a plan to get the kid out, recommend to my associate judge at the preliminary hearing that afternoon. We still continue our deep accountability court, our high-risk kids, okay, to make sure that they're connected with us and vice versa in the world. And so, with that said, I want to point out with the FAST panel, that is the multidisciplinary review, some of the other outcomes is that we're staying connected with those youth. One of the things, how are you doing? How's the family doing? We've developed care packages, food packages. We're getting them delivered to the homes, okay? So I'll stop there. I think I've done a pretty much overlay of that, but thank you.
Thank you, Judge. DINA, I would ask the same question of you, and then I will have some follow-up questions for the whole panel to weigh in on.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, AMORE and Judge, for your comments. I'm sitting here today with a bunch of notes in front of me, but I'm also pondering and feeling very heavy as an African-American woman about the subject in which we are talking about today. So I first want to open and just kind of acknowledge the pain and suffering of people who look like me today. I want to just send my condolences to the family, the George Floyd family, to the city of Minneapolis and all the people of color in this country, especially African Americans, my brothers and sisters at this time, not only impacted by the tragedy that is happening to people who look like me, but also a pandemic that's impacting heavily on particularly African Americans at this time. I just want you to know, Minneapolis, George Floyd family, we stand in solidarity with you. We have come to this country 400 years ago, not by choice, but by force, and have lived in this land, not as human beings and not being able to participate in the promises written in the Constitution of this land. So we stand, even in this conference, in solidarity with you, with Minneapolis, with all our Black and brown and people of color who are suffering, our LGBTQI people. We stand in solidarity with you today. And I just want to quote that In the end, we will not remember the words of our enemy, but the silence of our friends. So thank you, everyone who has joined us today. Thank you for your beautiful words, AMORE, of partnership, collaboration, connection. And if the judge said that we're going to dive in right now, I want to take us for a swim. And what we are talking about today. We're talking about a justice system, and what we need is an alternative to the current justice system that we have. Restorative practice is about an alternative to the current justice system, involving the people who are most impacted by crime and conflict and negative behavior in our current system, and giving them a voice in the process. In this current process, the voice of the people most impacted, the victims, the offenders, the community most impacted by this crime that has happened within their own communities, is taken away. What restorative practice does is it gives the voice back to the people most impacted, makes them part of the agreement process to be able to reintegrate people back into the community in a healthy way, thereby healing the community. It's not just victim and offenders that are most affected, or Black and brown people that are offended by our current justice system. It's also our communities as well. And so what I want to bring to you today is, what is the alternatives that we can have? We talk about the system works exactly the way the system is supposed to work, so maybe we need a new system. And so that's kind of what I'm coming to you today. And because of the current situation, and because I am an African-American woman, I am looking at this very, very differently today. I have some facts, because I want to make this really, really real. I don't want to talk about this as something that's distant. I want to pull this in for us, and to be able to engage what we're really talking about today. So the pandemic is not just a public health crisis. It's a racial and economic one. The people most impacted by this, our youth, our elderly, is because of the racial, health, and economic disparities that we have in this country. African Americans, and I'll make this personal, I'm from Buffalo, New York. African Americans on the east side of Buffalo have a higher poverty rate. They suffer from more health care than the rest of the people within our city. We have higher rates of cancer, infant mortality, in addition to higher risk of heart failure, diabetes, compared to our white counterparts that live in our own city. And this is according to the New York State Health Department. Much of our health inequities in Buffalo, New York are because of high unemployment, underdeveloped neighborhoods, absence of grocery stores in poor neighborhoods, access to health care. The disparities have also led to choices for people to enter into a criminal justice system. We have a system that is set up to direct people within the criminal justice system. And once they're in the criminal justice system, we have a system that keeps them in the criminal justice system. Buffalo is the 6th most segregated city in the nation. 64% of the people of color are concentrated in the areas of poverty. They are ranked the 6th poorest city, and we have the 4th highest poverty rate for our children. Graduation rates in Buffalo is about 64%, with a gap rate for people of color that is 14.5% and 15.5% for our Latino brothers and sisters. So when I think about all of these statistics and the opportunity in our criminal justice system, unless we begin to understand or be proactive in the systems before our criminal justice systems, we will never, ever change the system in our criminal justice system. So we need to be proactive in a way that we are not just addressing our criminal justice system when people get into the system, but what are we doing for people before they get into the system? So we need to look at not just one system, but our system that is set up as a whole. there is hope. And so that's part of that swim, right? We're in a hope. We're talking about partnership. We're talking about collaboration. We're talking about the reality of trauma-informed care. We need to put on here talking about the reality of mental health as well. And so how does that fit into our criminal justice system? And how many people that are suffering from mental health are in our criminal justice system currently? But locally, Erie County Restorative Justice Coalition, in partnership with Family Court, Brenda Friedman, the Center for Judge Brenda Friedman, the Center for Resolution and Justice, under the direction of Julie Lesh, and Probation, Erie County Restorative Justice Coalition is offering an opportunity or a pilot program within Family Court in which we can have restorative cases come through the Center for Resolution and Justice, in which we can bring victims and offenders together and have them talk about the impact of the behavior that caused them to do crimes. So underlining behaviors that direct people to actually commit crimes, but then also giving the victim a voice in which that we can repair that harm. So we're looking at underlying issues that victims are suffering, underlying issues in which offenders are suffering, and then the impact that that has on our community. So what is the impact that that has on our community when victims and offenders in the community are suffering? And then how can we heal that relationships between the victims and heal the relations between the offenders so that we can restore the community as a whole? Our system now, what we do in our system now, once we criminalize a person, once we criminalize a youth, we set people in that system. It's a 67% recidivism rate in our criminal justice system. Let's just be real about that. In successful restorative practice programs, it's an 85% success rate. 85% of the people who enter into restorative practice do not commit a crime again within 1 year. And I will give you some of that in our pilot program. That is what's happening. 85% of the people that are entering our pilot program, and we're seeing a lot of this in the city of Denver, are not recommitting crimes within the first year. This pilot program that we have done in Buffalo in partnership with Family Court, Judge Friedman, and the Center for Resolution and Justice, we've seen about 100 cases so far. It's a fairly new program. The kids or youth that we are seeing at this time are between the ages of 14 and 16. 49% have been identified as female, 51% identified themselves as male. 43% have been white, 34% African American, 13% are identified as multi-race, and 9% are non-responsive in identification. But out of all these cases that we have seen, there has been great success in the cases that we have seen. And so what we are doing is we want to expand this program to other courts, giving youth the opportunities not just to be accountable and responsible for behavior, but also offering what are the resources we needed to change behavior. So we need to, as a community, collaborate together in programs like this pilot program to be able to offer alternatives to our current justice system. Also, we are in an effort to network restorative practice in schools. So we talked about what does that proactiveness look like. If we start doing restorative practices in schools, we can begin to find out what are the underlying issues that youth are experiencing in schools. And then we provide the resources in schools. We talk about trauma-informed care. We talk about mental health. Why isn't that offered in schools? Why can't we be proactive with offering those things? We also are involved in educating our criminal justice system in restorative practice through conversations. Currently, they're happening on Zoom, but in partnership with Voice Buffalo, we are bringing people together from family court, child protective services, foster cares, adoption, child welfare, and community members and parents and students, and having conversations about how can we move forward in a positive way, in ways that are not harming people, but in ways that are proactive, giving people what they need in order to, number one, keep our youth in families. So we really want to be proactive. We need to keep youth within their families as well. And so not in our criminal justice system, but in our families. And so what are the needs that we need to do that? Or what are the resources that we need to do that? We as an organization, we offer free restorative practice training to our community members because we believe it is a great way to engage and speak with each other, not to each other and not for each other, but how do we begin to speak with each other in a way that we can become and develop being the best community that we can be. We cannot be the best community we can be unless all voices are heard. So we need to create places and spaces, even in our criminal justice system, where the community voice is valued just as much as the voice of our judges, our criminal justice system, our DAs, our lawyers. The community voice needs to have that much weight within that conversation. We also work with the Greater Buffalo Equity Roundtable and having these juvenile justice, racial equity conversations. And so when we talk about, let's not omit the race conversation when we're talking about justice. And so that needs to be part of our conversation as well. We are also in Erie County in these community conversations, having conversations about, you know what, if we can release inmates 45 days early because of COVID and a health crisis within our prisons, why can't we release them or have these kind of opportunities for them to be released without COVID? And so if we can do it for COVID, what are some opportunities that we can look at right now that maybe it's either early release? There are different ways that we can look at our criminal justice system so people can come together, have these restorative conversations, be able to repair the harm toward the victim and toward community, and then be able to get the resources they need in the positive way. And then finally, I'm just going to end it really quickly here. I would like Erie County to look at minimizing the spread of COVID by providing even the people when they release them, because I think that's a great idea, but what are you giving them when they leave? Are we giving them places and safe spaces to stay? Is it possible to utilize empty hotels right now to, number one, give prisoners that are released early from prison the resources that they need in order to be reintegrated back into community, but also the competency skills to make them, as we call them, responsible people within community. And I think I'm just going to stop there. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. There's so much here, and I'm going to go a little bit off script because I heard some really important things in what all of you said, and what I really heard was a paradigm shift in the way people are thinking, all the way from just a completely different system, right, DINA, which is the restorative approach, to really understanding that our thinking, maybe we need to restart our thinking, Judge, around what is, where our bottom is, or our ceiling, depending on which view that we have. And AMORE, you were sort of talking about the inclusion and the healing paradigm in this. So if maybe you could all talk together about sort of how do you bring people along who may not be ready for a paradigm shift? How do you persuade people who are critical partners in reform, in coming along? None of us can do this alone. What are your best tools and strategies for persuasion and partnering? And I'll go off mute and any of you can answer that.
I will respond because thank you, DINA, for laying out some of the power that lies within community to heal and keep themselves safe. I think that part of what we need to be talking about in this conversation is that reforms can only go so far. We have to be ready for them. Our heart has to be ready for them. Trauma and resiliency informed work is not simply about looking at an instance and saying, oh, this person has experienced trauma, so they deserve X, Y, and Z outcomes. No, trauma and resiliency informed work is a lived perspective. It is me seeing you, DINA, in this moment and holding space for the pain that you are feeling alongside your community members. It is Judge standing here and saying, I acknowledge this pain as well. It is all of us together coming in to see we are impacted by this moment. And I truly believe, as Judge said before, that in this work, I have not met a person who does not want or think that they are doing what is best for children and communities. And so because of that, because we are all impacted by this moment, even if disparately, as Nina opened, we can use this to acknowledge the pain that we are all experiencing, the loss that we are all experiencing, and use the tools of healing work to understand and internalize what it means to be trauma-informed, what it means to truly rehabilitate and move towards a place of restoration where each person can feel safe. Because I know that even people who have engaged in this moment, who have engaged in systems, trust the system to do its job and believe that it has historically been doing that. And I think that now we are moving to a paradigm shift, and it is our duty to pay attention, not just for our communities, for our families, but also for ourselves as workers in the system who want a safe world.
If I may piggyback what AMORE is saying, I've met many of you, and I'm sure there's a number that are watching that I've met. And I've spent a good bit of time in the state of New York at the request of the late and most honorable Judith Kaye. And so for some of you that are listening, you have heard my system's approach to resolving this very question. And really the question, if I may kind of rephrase it, is that we're really talking about depoliticizing crime and punishment is what we're really talking about, okay? And just for the listeners here, I have an article that's about to be published in the Georgia Law Review, volume 54, issue 4, and if you could be looking for it, because you can get it online when it comes out. But it's titled Georgia Juvenile Justice Reform, a collective decision-making approach to depoliticize crime and punishment, okay? So for those of you in New York, I spent my time at the request of Judge Kaye on school justice partnerships. And I had developed a toolkit, and she was very intrigued by the toolkit because for those who have trouble, understanding, like, for example, much of what I've done over the years that has resulted in an 80% reduction in delinquency filings. And by the way, there's a 64% reduction in felony filings, okay? We're talking about serious offenses, which means there's 64% fewer victims, okay? Looks soft on crime, right? And that bothers some people. All right, for whatever reason, it could be politically because they like the fact that it looks tough, and so we need to be tough. If you do the crime, you need to do the time. Others, it's like, well, they didn't know. They haven't really had an opportunity to look at the research, okay, and see what really being smart on crime looks like, which does tend to look soft on crime, okay? If you look at it from a lens of appearance, that is harshness. That's what we tend to define toughness. I define toughness as how many fewer victims there'll be, okay? Now, having said that, that means that when we approach trying to find solutions, okay, to our problems, we need to set up guardrails in order to ensure that the political rhetoric does not enter the conversation, okay? And I'll give you a brief example. When I was sitting for the number of years I sat on the criminal justice reform until it ended in 2018, we set up some guardrails. And that's what I talk about in this upcoming article, is that, the rules were, number one, you cannot offer an opinion unless you can show and document the data to support it, okay? We are not going to talk about solutions unless you can show that there's evidence that they do work, or they're promising, okay, in working. All right. Now think about it. That means that when we had our conversations and we met, and somebody decided to say something that was, kind of like that political rhetoric we're used to hearing, to get tough. The question was, well, hold on a minute. Now I hear what you're saying, but tell me, you need to support that. Where's the evidence? Did you bring it here today? No, well, then we're not going to talk about it. Okay. And as a result of that, we moved within several months, okay, because we were now laser focused on dealing with the truth about what works. And in several months, we ended up recommending to the governor the most substantial, significant overhaul of a juvenile justice system, okay, in which Georgia today is being heralded as a result thereof. And so I will leave it to that, because, I think I've answered your question, Nina, that, how do we do that? And I think we need to have rules in the first place that creates a safe place to have these conversations.
Thank you.
Go ahead, DINA.
How do we get buy-in? That is a restorative practice struggle, because this restorative practice isn't new. It's indigenous to many cultures. It is how peace-loving people bring peace and justice to a society. I have to think about our current justice system and thinking about how is it working. When I look at youth that look like me, who are mostly impacted by the criminal justice system, it's not working for us. We're sitting here today, hearts heavy, because it's not working for us. Not that it can't work for us, but it has historically not worked for people of color. And when I think about that, and the reality that I need, and the reality that I think about, so just coming from my reality is, being brought here by force to this country. There was a police system set up to keep me in check as a culture. So there is some fear in the Black and brown culture of our current justice system. So how do we get buy-in? Is we get buy-in like this. We have to have open dialogue and open communication. I believe that the idea of our current justice system is good. I believe that the aspirations of our current justice systems is good. But I believe it needs some work. And the work is that we need to get people in power to come to the table. Because if we're talking about data, if we're talking about if a system works, then we need to talk about the fact that there's a 67% recidivism rate in our current criminal justice system. We need to talk about that there is 1 in 25, I'm sorry, now it's 1 in 14 African-American children has a loved one in our criminal justice system. We need to take a look at when we talk about in the early 80s and 90s that our criminal justice system had a war on drugs, but now we have a pandemic for opioids. Like, if we really want to have a conversation, we need to have a conversation about our criminal justice system, and we need to have open dialogue that talks about this data that is really out there. We need to learn, we need to teach, we need to read, and I'm so proud, Judge, that you are writing about this, because people need to hear about the successes that are happening in Georgia. We need to replicate those successes throughout the United States. And I know that Denver has an awesome restorative justice system, both in their courts and in their schools, and they're having a lot of success in that. And I'd like to see that and those policy changes and those legislations that are happening in Denver, Colorado. I'd like to see those throughout our whole United States of America, that I'm struggling with being united in that. So I'm also thinking about We elevate our success stories. So in my experience in restorative practice, actually started in schools, introducing restorative practice to schools that had a high rate of suspension, and to combat that, they created an in-school suspension room, which was, I don't know, still not much different because kids still weren't in class learning. And so if I'm not in school learning, and if I'm away from school, and we know that if kids are suspended from school twice in 9th grade, they are 50% less likely to not graduate from high school. And so that's another conversation about how do we end suspension. So how do we end these systems that put people in the criminal justice system? But anyway, in that school, we were able, in that in-school suspension room, to really get to the underlying issues that were causing these repeated behaviors. Students were coming into the in-school suspension room, just like our criminal justice system, for repeated behavior, saying or evidence that the underlying issues for them causing the behavior was not addressed. So after we used the restorative process to address the underlying behavior, behaviors began to change because the needs were met. And so when the needs were met, there was no other need to get that attention. And then in that process, the beautiful thing about it is that I no longer had kids in in-school suspension, and we were able to actually do more proactive things to address issues that students were still having. And so we took that kind of replica and then we expanded it out. We've been rolling that out in about, right now we're working with 3 different school districts with that kind of model, how to support students in building stronger communities. And then when there is a conflict, how do we restoratively address that conflict using a restorative process? Replicating all that and also into our criminal justice system, looking at like, how do we address the underlying issues first before we criminalize the behavior? So how do we address how do we address these? To me, the buy-in is really about how do we get the buy-in by asking people to come to the table and let's just have a conversation. So, I think that's kind of what I'm thinking. We as an organization are at many community tables right now, having many community conversations with people that, number one, can change policy, that people who are in our criminal justice system, that people who are have the ability to decide in court, lawyers and judges, can we offer restorative response, or is this a criminal justice response? Or can we do both responses?
I actually have a response to that. I'm sorry.
No.
I have a response to that. I was just moved. You touched my spirit because what you're really speaking to is so important. The underlying causes of what is really occurring in the instant offense. We have to look at that, right? So when applying a trauma and resiliency informed perspective to, I see in the chat, someone said, someone said that, you know, they're concerned about the closure and burning of property in this moment. And you know, notwithstanding that the large majority of people who are calling for justice at this moment are peaceful, let's apply a trauma and resiliency informed perspective to that behavior. If we understand behavior as information and we're seeing that property is being destroyed, that people are, you know, setting target on fire, or whatever the case may be, that kind of behavior, what does that tell us in this moment? If we have the knowledge that communities are being disparately impacted across the board by COVID-19, coupled with the repeated trauma of witnessing failures of our law enforcement system that is sworn to protect them, we have to understand that this is not we can't decontextualize it, and rather use it as information and an invitation to do better. So part of the work that has been I've been doing in my system is we launched the Pride Initiative, which is a trauma and resiliency informed system change approach. It uses a equity-focused perspective to this work. So really the way that we're doing it is about looking at internal agency culture, how we treat and perceive each other, how we can build on our own strengths so we can step into our better versions of ourselves internally, because we know that that reflects our external partnerships, right? We know that that reflects our response to the community. This is also in collaboration with multi-system actors who will attend the Georgetown Center for Juvenile Justice Reform Supporting LGBTQ Youth Certificate Program. It's a very long title, but we will be attending that program to develop some cross-system responsivity. Because a lot of what you were speaking to, DINA, is that there are, we can no longer silo these issues, but rather they happen, you know, in the conditions and contexts which communities have to deal with. So if we know better and we have the ability to do better, then I truly believe we can use this moment to be better.
Okay, I have to say amen. That is so good. That's equity. I think that is the key word there. I mean, we need to look at the equity, because there's an inequity there's an inequity with COVID, right? So the inequity is because there's our people of color who are suffering from COVID because of health inequities, because of economic inequities, because of racial inequities, economic inequities. We look at the response to the killing of George Floyd as an inequity as well. And that could be a justice inequity. And so we talk about the rioting or the damage that is happening to property. And I know that Black and brown people are thinking about, you know what, I feel like I've been violated. Like I feel that the same thing that's happening to property is happening to my own body. And why is that not the same outrage over my body, over my life, than we have over buildings and things? And so it's so interesting, because when we look at the people who are, because we're talking about youth, when we look at the people who are rioting, which I don't really care for that word, but who are rioting, I love the point of looking at that underlying behavior, like what is causing that frustration that is saying, see me. There is a wonderful Zulu greeting that says, I am here to be seen. And it's called Zabona, I'm here to be seen. And we acknowledge, I see you. So this is an outcry. I am here to be seen. Do you see me? Will you see me? And is there an equity? We're talking about equity. Is there an equity in which we are viewing the people who are doing this?
Thank you. I think this is a very powerful conversation. And as I'm listening, I'm thinking about going back to the idea of a paradigm shift. You know, one of the words and the themes that I'm hearing is healing. And healing is a different construct than treatment. And the system often seeks treatment for, fill in the blank, this behavior, this particular issue. But we really haven't spent a lot of time focused on what would it mean if we had a healing framework? How do we heal? DINA, you really were talking about, right, the underlying causes. That's a healing framework. That if recognizing all of the loss, right, the institutional loss, the generational loss, right, the First Peoples talk about the generational trauma, the community loss and the individual loss. Many young people, the 1 in 14 have family who are incarcerated, right? The losses now to COVID, the loss of stabilizing institutions with not even being able to go to school or go to their programs. What would a healing framework, like how would you apply that? And Judge, you mentioned the conversations with the family that I'm hoping you can talk more about, in the care packages, which feels very healing. So I just want to throw out the paradigm of healing versus, not that treatment is not important, but that's very individual and implies something is wrong with the person rather than a healing. So I'm just going to throw this out before I get lost in my own words. Who'd like to talk about a healing framework?
Well, I'm glad to start it off, jump start it. So to create, you're absolutely right, Nina. We got to be careful how we phrase when we use the word healing. So, this is about creating healing communities. That, and understanding, number one, the basic principles is that we are all a community, regardless of, our appearance, our social status, economic status. I can't remember who once said it. I think one great writer or poet had said, maybe one of the listeners can Google this and let me know, but on the chat line here, but we, in today's world, our communities are divided between railroad tracks. Who lives on this side of the railroad track? Who lives on this side of the railroad track? Today we use zip codes, justice by zip codes. We know the inequities there just by where you live, and the folks who are in the poor zip codes, are dumped on with a number of inequities. But where I'm going with this is this person had said, but one day when we all die, there won't be any railroad tracks. There won't be any zip codes. We need to be thinking about how we can create a healing community so that there are no railroad tracks and zip codes, figuratively speaking, in that sense. So to tie this in, to be more specific and bring it, from 35,000 feet, on down, really everything that we've been talking about, the three of us, it's about building relationships. How do we reconfigure our community systems, collectively speaking, all right, so that the systems promote, not wait, but promote for the people who work within those systems to be aggressive about promoting positive relationships with the people we serve. I can give you simple examples that we use already in many communities. The Houston police chief was speaking about this on national news, and that's effective community policing. All right, you can either go ahead and sit in your patrol car and drive around neighborhoods, or you can either create bike patrols, or get out of those patrol cars and walk the neighborhoods and talk to the people and get to know the people and understand their plight. Because the bottom line is, people who are in the poor communities who are getting the rough end of it, they're not going to open up and talk to us. All right. And in the beginning, as I was a judge, they're not going to talk. I'm a judge. I'm part of the system. I'm part of the system that's hurting them, in different ways. That's how they see me. So that's why I had to learn to develop certain strategies that some people may say is corny or it may be unjudge-like. Well, to heck with them. It works. It works. All right. Like when it's appropriate, after an adjudication of a kid who's delinquent, and I found that he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now it's time to figure out those underlying causes that DINA was talking about. All right. And I employ the epidemiology model that my father taught me, because he retired from CDC. He was in infectious diseases. And there's two basic facts. Number one, diseases don't occur by chance. And diseases are not randomly distributed. My dad told me way back then in 2002, he pointed to me, he said, now, son, I want you to understand, diseases, delinquent behaviors are not diseases, but they behave like them. So I want you to take the word diseases and replace it with the word delinquent behaviors. Delinquent behaviors don't occur by chance. Delinquent behaviors are not randomly distributed, which means they can be studied to find the root causes. And then he said, you know what the problem is with you people in criminal justice? You punish symptoms. That's what you do. Instead of looking at the delinquent behavior as a symptom of something that's much deeper, you you run roughshod over it and you never get to the root problem. And that opened up my, it was a revelation, for me. And so to bring this full circle to the healing community, all right, we need to be looking at our systems and developing a collective approach where we connect all the various systems from social services to mental health and so forth and so on with a framework of building positive relationships. And you know what? Don't worry about looking corny. Don't worry about it. I mean, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote a powerful piece in the LA Times about these riots that are going on. Going to what DINA was talking about. What's the root cause of the violent aspect of these things? Yeah, we don't want property destroyed. We don't want people hurt, okay? No, we're not going to justify, but there's a difference between excusing or justifying and understanding it, okay? Let's take our judgment lenses off for a moment. And let's start opening up our heads and looking at why is that part? What's really underneath it? Because I'm gonna tell you folks, some of us aren't able to do it so readily because we're not walking in the shoes of people of color, like myself, okay? The only way that I'm gonna get to know the plight of people of color and poor people, okay, is for me to interact with them face to face and be open and let them talk and let me listen and not respond with any judgment or conclusion, okay? And because they're not going to talk to me unless I create that safe place. And so that's really what we have to do. And there are strategies to do that, which I don't have time to get into right now. But we've been doing that by creating the FAST panel, going to those, like developing the care packages and all of that, because we're thinking to ourselves, well, yeah, we're a judicial system and, it's all about crime and punishment. You do the crime. No, it's really not about that. If you really want to reduce crime, you got to create those positive relationships. And to do that, you've got to start putting feet to it, like things like care packages, food packages. Hey, how you doing today? Are you making it? What's going on? Okay. So I'm going to stop there because I'm getting preachy right now. I apologize.
Reach on.
I'm sorry. The thing about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, I'm sorry, AMORE. I missed a whole thing about Kareem. The thing is about looking corny. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, if y'all recall, he was one of the greatest NBR basketball players, right? But he sucked at the free throw line, okay? Had like a 52%. But you remember that year he started the season and he did the granny shot, where you go underneath and you do it that way, and he was laughed at, but he went up, in his percentage, right? That was also the year that he made the record of the most points scored in a single game by a player, 100 points. But the next year when he went up, he didn't do that. He went back to overhead, right? And his percentage points went down. When he retired, he was asked, hey, what happened? Did it not work for you, the granny shot? He said, oh, it worked. Well, how come you didn't keep doing it? Because he said it made me look like a sissy. Folks, we in this system, if we don't start doing what's right because we're afraid how it's going to make us look politically or otherwise, okay, what a shame. What a shame. I'm sorry, Maury.
Never that. Thank you. I wanted to say here, a couple of points that you mentioned, that healing is not linear. Healing is collaborative. Healing is equity focused. Healing is relational. Healing is flexible. It ebbs and flows. It is not perfect, and it is responsive to that ebbing and flowing. So how do we take all of those values of healing and apply them to a system that is so focused on treatment, that is focused more so on the check boxes of what success looks like? And I want to highlight here the work of our diversion practice. Our diversion coordinators have been focused and responsive and healing oriented in responding to this current situation. And they've done that by tracking and understanding what's going on in our caseloads, by removing, as Judge said, our judging lens, and instead seeing what is needed, what is necessary. How can we support you through this? So we've relied heavily on creative community partnerships in this moment to also address the underlying causes of what is going on. We've asked ourselves, how can we consider that the youth in this case is dealing with all of these issues, from COVID-19, from school closures, from the current calls for justice across the country, all of the stress of that, right? How can we consider that more urgently in safety? And because of that, we have really been able to offer alternative solutions and expand our diversion practice. Simultaneously, we've developed a partnership with the Mayor's Office to End Gender-Based Violence to develop a curriculum that is responsive to our family crisis cases. Unfortunately, we've seen a significant increase in family crisis cases at this time. That is unsurprising, right? Most youth and families are inside with each other. There's tension, there's all of the other stressful factors contributing to that tension. Any of us in that situation might, without a respite from that tension, might result in some sort of violent interaction. I know I myself had to get out of my house this weekend. It's normal for us to have that because, again, healing ebbs and flows and is based on ourselves and situations. So acknowledging that all of those different factors are occurring in the lives of families and communities, acknowledging that, as we said earlier, youth thrive when in family. How can we better respond to these cases? So we are developing that training that will restructure our responsivity and understanding of family offense cases. And also, we've built out partnerships with community-oriented organizations that can provide respite or can provide shelter for youth who may not be able to return home after a family offense. This is especially important because our community-oriented partners who are, not a detention setting, but rather a shelter or a shelter place, are LGBTQ affirming and responsive. So we know that that is specifically important, and we've identified these providers specifically because we know that family rejection and family violence and family crisis is one of the things that impacts LGBTQ youth the most. We know that's the #1 leading cause of LGBTQ youth homelessness. We know that LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. And so again, the trajectory of that, how can we intervene and center healing before it escalates to a point where a tense moment in a family results in system involvement. So we've revamped the practice there, and I think that that's a highlight of the ways that we can center healing in our responsivity.
AMORE, can I just try to unpack this a little bit, because there's a lot in what you've been talking about with the, particularly around the family situations. When you're talking about centering healing, can you talk about concretely what that looks like, language that you use, or even how you're interacting with people virtually these days, right? So people can really have an understanding of when you say healing, what do you mean, and how can they apply that framework?
Sure. So one of the examples is, you might have seen me or heard me slip up. I said family offense. We're trying to centralize or de-shift that focus because language is so important. Language creates culture and perception. So we want to restructure that to, for example, use family crisis. Some of the things I mentioned, right, the layering out of the stresses and impact on families of this moment and the conditions with which they have to deal with and operate within, internalizing and understanding and empathy for that is part of the healing work. It's also, applying these principles to ourselves and acknowledging that we as people are also experiencing the world in this moment, and giving ourselves the space to exist and show up more genuinely. I think it's also about building relationships with families to understand, what their concerns are, what they need. It's family centered. It's focused on their needs versus focusing on their needs versus focusing on what we think would help. It's collaborative, and it is also equity focused, considering how we can help the family thrive regardless of how we can help the family thrive. Was that?
Yes.
Okay.
So I've been, I'm being moderated by external moderators, so I want to make sure, because this has just been such a rich dialogue, I want to make sure we get to really one of our critical questions, which is about institutionalization of this change. And really, what of the recent adaptations due to COVID do you think you're going to institutionalize and solidify, and why? And, what do you need to do that? And what do you see sort of the future of solidifying and institutionalizing those changes would mean? And what resources would you need? It's a big question.
Well, Dina, you go ahead.
I'm just pondering so many things because there's such a good richness of vocabulary that's coming out of here. Like we're talking about collaboration, engagement, healing, relationships, ebbs and flows. We're talking about these creative conversations, and I think they're also rooted together. And really, what are the next steps? What do we need to look at? What policies need to happen? And but I just want to also talk about like that important voice that tends to be ignored. We're talking about them, but they are not with us. And so when we talk about engagement, it's like, where is that youth voice and what do you need? And so I also want to talk about a little bit before we get to that question about creating places and spaces for youth voices to be heard. And so we as an organization, as we're talking about this, we've been holding youth circles. I mean, we've been asking them, what is the impact of COVID on you? What is the impact that I can no longer see my friends, which was my huge social connection? You want to talk about an impact of trauma on students right now is I don't even have my friends to talk to right now. If I am having an impact in my house, that was the first person that you went to. If something is happening in my home, my first person I went to was my friend. So I don't want to miss that we make sure that we are creating spaces for young people to not only talk about how this is impacting them, but then giving them opportunities to get back to their own community. I know that a lot of the things that we've learned out of talking to young people is that this is not just a conversation about expressing emotion, creating a safe space for you to be able to talk about your experience, but what can I do about this? We got young people who are full of energy. I want some action steps. I see my community hurting. What can I do in this COVID to help heal my community? So we have often, we have done some fun stuff with youth for self-care. We do yoga via video. We have done mindfulness, meditation. We play some pretty wild games and just really trying to help youth to stay youth within this COVID crisis, right? But then we also have given them opportunities to serve their community. We talked about the people most impacted by the COVID crisis, which is our seniors. And so when we look at our seniors that can't go, we talked about the inequities in viable grocery stores within poor areas. And so we do in partnership, we're talking about collaboration and partnership again, in partnership with the church, we feed seniors every Friday. We take them a bag of groceries and a hot meal every Friday. And we use youth to help us do that. We have picked up and cleaned up for communities. For some reason, they have removed all the garbage cans around the city that used to be on the street. They are no longer there. And so we are empowering youth to make changes even that way too. And to actually go door to door, our mayor had a campaign that we just hung, if you need help, there were door hangers that you could put on your door so that a neighbor in your neighborhood would be acknowledged if you needed help, and they could come over and ask you a question using the COVID, of course, guidelines. But we use youth to go door to door and hang those on people's doorknobs. And so getting youth involved is really, really important too. We do want to recognize we want to be as proactive as possible so that we give youth the opportunity to make good choices not to enter into the criminal justice system. So I just want to make sure that it's so important that when we're talking about this healing, when we're talking about grief, and when we're talking about all these things, that we're also creating this space so youth can have a voice in there and say, this is what I need. Like, I just need a yoga class right now, or how can we play basketball? I mean, we're trying to create how to play a game of basketball via Zoom. And so as crazy as it sounds, but that's a youth idea. I think we could do it. So I just want to make sure that we're talking about that too.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I just want to thank you for saying that, because it's so important. I see here our awesome note taker. Look at this graphic. It's amazing. It says youth voices in the conversation. Let's change that to youth voices central to the conversation, because if we're talking about you without you, we're not going to have the right answer. So I just wanted to make sure that we do that. I'm sorry if I did not explicitly say that youth need to be central to the conversation, and I appreciate DINA for clarifying and centralizing that. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I think this panel is awesome. And so this panel right here is an example of collaboration. And so we can't do what we do in a silo. We need to continue to have these conversations. We need to continue to engage in these conversations with action steps. And so that we can raise up that data that the judge has brought up. We need to raise up these data points by working together and finding out what works. And so in answering the question that Nina posed a bit ago, I would just say that right now there are some things that we are working on, and one is policy change. I mean, we need to begin to change policy and collaborate with people to begin to change policy and I will start at the beginning, in our school systems. In what way are we addressing student behaviors within our school systems so that we can break that school to prison pipeline? Like I said, if you're not in school, if you are suspended from school, 2 to 3 times, you are less likely to graduate from high school. And so why not develop a policy that we can end suspension or have an alternative to suspension? And I don't mean taking the kid away from education, but what are some alternatives that we can do with that? I know in Buffalo, New York, we are working with a group of people to end suspensions from pre-K to 3rd grade. And yes, they suspend pre-K students. And so we're looking at how do you end suspension from pre-K to 3rd grade. We're also looking at implementing more restorative practice programs. It is in our code of conduct. How do we implement that with fidelity, providing the funding that is necessary for that and trauma-informed care to be a central part of what we're offering to schools? How do we place that in existing multi-tier systems that are in schools? How do we fund teachers? How do we get the buy-in for that? So I think that is something that we should be looking at as a short-term and long-term, a long-term system. I also think that we need more research. I know in Buffalo, New York, there is the University at Buffalo, in collaboration with the African American Disparities Task Force, is focusing on using students for research across the university to address the problems of disparities in the city of Buffalo. And I mentioned where we are in the city of Buffalo in our poverty rate. So looking at the people most impacted by poverty and doing some research on that. I also think that we should be looking at short and long term, how do we expand programs in our criminal justice system that offer more restorative practices in lieu of incarceration, probation, and PINs, and all of those things. Again, partnering with community-based organizations and looking at those underlying needs. I do know that there are several cities in New York State, I believe it's Syracuse and Albany, that use a program that's called LEAD, the Law Enforcement Assistant Diversion Program. And they use community members to come together to address issues that youth are facing as a diversion program, and to approach the goals of improving policy and safety and public order in our criminal justice system, involving the people who are most impacted by crime. And then last, I would like to think about like using the district attorney's office to avoid prosecuting low-level offenses that pose no risk to public safety. So can we look at an alternative to that as well? And we can look at some examples, again, that is happening in Denver, Colorado. So really, what resources do we need? We need awareness for the community, providing community support and resources, involving that community voice. We need to train people in the criminal justice system about alternatives to the existing system, such as restorative practice, mediation, or conflict coaching for our youth. We need to share the responsibility of community safety with the community. We need policies to support that. We need funding. We need funding to make these things happen. These nonprofit organizations are people that function because they have the passion to do the work. They are the grassroots people that are in community. They need funding to keep it going and to help. They are huge in keeping community members safe and keeping the community concerns keeping the community's concerns aware to the people who change policies. We need more restorative practice because it is a victim-centered approach. A lot of times in this system, the victim's voice is lost, and the victim's voice needs to be heard to be said, what is safe for me? And then we need to just continue to train more community-based restorative practice facilitators, because I believe if we really want to change communities, the people that facilitate the conferences need to come from the communities that are impacted by that crime. And so that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Well, that's great. That's a lot. That's a lot of good stuff there, DINA. First of all, I want to say I'm a restorative justice judge. Okay. In fact, I have a division in my court I created several years ago, and it's titled Restorative Justice Division. So, you know, in answering that question from my vantage point as a jurist in the juvenile justice system, okay, let me begin with, you know, kind of tying up something I said earlier when in the first question, you know, what changes have we made, you know, in the outcomes. And that's very important. You know, for those who don't know, you know, my master's is in political science. My concentration was in systems theory. Okay. And you know, in doing that, you know, systems at a basic level, you analyze it by looking at, you know, it's operating within an environment, and to what extent in that environment that environment is affecting that particular system. You know, that's where you get your inputs. And then what does the process look like, the decision-making process look like within that decision, within that system to produce the best outcome. The thing about juvenile justice, ladies and gentlemen, is that we're not a single entity. Okay, we need to break the traditional definition of juvenile justice. It's not just your juvenile court, or it's not just the juvenile court and your Department of Juvenile Justice or your probation and left there. The juvenile justice system is everybody, every system within your community that touches a child in one way or another in serving a child. Social services, mental health, other providers, private, for-profit, it doesn't matter. So you have to develop, you have to change it. Instead of it going from a single system approach, you have to look at juvenile justice and analyze it from a multi-systemic, okay, approach. And so you have to configure it where all these multiple systems are now connected in some way. And the best way to do it is for some champion or champions in your community to bring them all together and have a conversation about developing some type of memorandum of understanding that brings them all together, working together, okay, with a mission statement and so forth and so on, that in there says, these are the outcomes we want, reduce recidivism and so forth and so on. Now, having laid that basic foundation, okay, you know, what I have learned from this pandemic, as I said earlier, is that it caused me, it clarified things, you know, for me regarding my own work, that, Steve, stop patting yourself on the back regard. So I'm being critical of myself. Okay. I'm not on here to deliver, okay, hey, this is all the great stuff we did. Well, yeah, okay. It is great, but it wasn't good enough. And that's my point. And so I hope that anyone who's involved in the system or has any type of policy making decision can lend a critical eye and begin coming out as we're going through this pandemic, start looking at your current system and ask yourself, whatever changes I've made, and I'm sure we all went into it because I did, thinking they were going to be temporary. All right. What are the outcomes so far? All right. And if they're in any way producing, good outcomes, then you need to ask yourself, should this change when the pandemic goes away? Should this not become the new norm? So having said that, from that analytical lens, all right, locally for me, I've already talked to my court administrator and my chief of staff. We're out to start drafting a change in our detention policy, adopting our current more restrictive admission criteria. Remember what I said? I've already released 95% of our detention population, and to this date, knock on wood, not a single kid has disrupted or reoffended. Remember what I said earlier? That begs the question, should I even detain him in the first place? Number one. So that's what we're going to be doing. And there's a lot more, because even the kids that we would have detained, like on felony property offenses that would have been detained, what we're doing is that we are meeting with them the next day with my intake, right now virtually, but going back to when we do get a vaccine, they'll just come in the next day, okay, with the parents and do an assessment. So they didn't have to suffer the detention. You don't have to go see a judge to get a GPS monitor put on you, for God's sakes, okay? So that's one thing. Another thing, these weekly status conferences, remember my comment about how I was learning as I got to know the kid and these conversations, when him sitting at the detention center, the parents are online, the public defender, and realizing this kid's not a violent kid. This kid doesn't have a character trait, okay, of violence. He just did a knucklehead thing. He just made a poor decision. Any of them could come. All these poor decisions can have root causes. There's reasons that we have to look at. And so I subsequently released them. So if I can reduce my average daily detention population from 15 down to what it is now, about 2 to 4, that means I can still continue to sustain these weekly status conferences. Okay? All right? So that's the other thing I'm going to start doing. One other thing I want to point out, and some of the participants had mentioned this about, this virtual meeting and all that. I'm going to switch over to my dependency side for a moment. Abuse and neglect, okay? Parents, reunification. Well, let me tell you what I'm learning. Our parental attendance at the dependency hearings that we're doing by Zoom has increased dramatically. So you know what? Want to talk about implicit bias? Now, I'm going to confess to you my implicit bias, that the parents in the past who didn't show up to court, the automatic judgment was that they didn't care about their kids. Okay? So this is a teaching moment. And so that's the other thing I'm going to start doing. I've already started talking to the attorneys that are parent attorneys and telling them, from now on, when you talk to them, I want you to start finding out, and I'm also telling the guardian ad litems to do the same thing. How many of these parents have transportation issues? How many of these parents have other insecurities? How many parents are intimidated about coming to court? They're scared, okay? And let's do it by Zoom. Let's keep the Zoom. Let's keep them involved with their children, okay? Let's not do the fundamental attribution error where we attribute our values and beliefs to other people, okay? Because what we're more likely going to judge them incorrectly. And I'm a judge, for God's sakes. Of all people, I need to judge the best I can. And I need to do it from their shoes and their lens. Now, with that said, I will end with this, okay? The whole care package and food package thing and all that concept is going to continue. So I've been talking to my coordinator of that, okay? And that, keep in mind, people still are going to have problems regardless of the pandemic. When this pandemic is over with, I mean, they're poor, they're suffering some critical issues. So we need, about that healing community, we need to keep that positive relationship going by proving that we care, by the acts that we do, okay? And lastly, I think at a countywide basis, you know, I know this can't go on, but, you know, we've suspended evictions in our county right now, okay? Now, I know we can't keep the suspensions. Of course we can. But I wonder if we can create a response team to people who are facing evictions. Is there a helpline, okay? Because I'm thinking of this idea because our county has already set up weekly meetings, virtual meetings on the cable TV thing, okay? You know, on getting services to people, where you can go for help and things of that nature. Well, why can't we even laser focus that even more? Lastly, Dina, you're absolutely right. You know, start using citations and not arresting people, okay? The cash bail system is another, you know, quite frankly, it's another like mini form of institutional slavery, okay? It disrupts people's lives, okay? And these are poor people, they can't afford it, all right? You know, and one other thing, I commend everyone, I'll end on this. Peter Edelman, since you mentioned AMORE at Georgetown University, he's a law professor emeritus. He worked for Senator Bobby Kennedy on the war on poverty. He was Bill Clinton's aide as well, okay? So he wrote a book, It's Not a Crime to Be Poor, okay? I highly recommend it. In fact, he cited, there's a section in there on my work dealing with people in poverty, okay? I'm not offering it to read my section now, okay? But the whole thing, it's very data enriched. I think it will open your eyes. Now I'll shut up.
Thank you, Judge. I will respond quickly so that we can get to questions. But thank you, Judge. You know, when we met as panelists for the tech check, Judge said, I thought there was nothing more to be done, and then I realized how much more I could do. So it's not only about asking that question during this moment in response to the pandemic, but also about pushing ourselves into that responsivity, as Judge mentioned the different ways that he has engaged in that. We need some more of that bravery and that openness. We need to be willing and ready to even make a mistake through this change. We need to be more ready to make that mistake if it results in disparate outcomes than we are ready to remain complicit in the ways that we have been. So we have to name and confront these inequities, as Judge said. We have to be able to see what people are experiencing each and every day, the conditions that contribute to community safety. And if we know, again, that communities have the responses and ability to, our job is to support that. Our job is to support the power of communities to heal and safe and keep themselves safe as well. And I want to also, again, highlight the importance of internalizing this work. As Judge said, it's not, his example was him going out and giving groceries to families. Yes, that is a level of care and support that is necessary. And how can we bolster that support that is already happening in communities? How can we make sure that we see that as a strength, as a protective factor, as a safety factor, and acknowledge that sometimes maybe not involving ourselves at all in those cases actually promotes safety. I think that this is a moment, as we started, that can create a much larger shift. We are at the beginning where we are at the beginning of opportunity to move forward in a way that implements a model of safety that centralizes healing, implements a model of safety where we can all feel really truly safe and good about the work that we are doing to promote that safety.
Thank you all. I'm going to turn to some of these questions. Some of them have been answered sort of throughout the dialogue, but I'm going to pull out a couple of them. So one of them is really about linking the impact of COVID and the protests, and how we can link the learning together so that we can help the communities. And I will just say that we need to have short answers because we have about 5 minutes left before Giza comes back in. So anybody have something they want to throw out for that about linking the learning from COVID and the protests that we're experiencing right now?
I think real quick that the common thread is that with the pandemic, we, and the whole sheltering at home, one of the things, in order to flatten the virus, the advice that public health officials and others, especially in social services, social workers, and psychologists and therapists are saying, but stay connected, stay connected, stay connected. And so now all of us are becoming experts in Zoom and Microsoft Teams and things of that nature, right? Okay, now how is that, the theme there of staying connected as it relates to the protests is this, and may already be happening, okay? But, I think that our community leaders that are experiencing these protests, I think it would behoove them if they started creating a connection with the protest leaders, okay? To be able to also, so while they're protesting, as a group, there's some dialogue that's going on, okay? I know, like, for example, here in Atlanta, one of the biggest things that the protesters are asking for is that there be a hate crime law. We're one of the states that still doesn't have a hate crime law. And that's really their number one issue. Because remember, we have Ahmaud Arbery that was murdered, while jogging, okay, down in Brunswick, right? So we have that particular issue for us that's unique. Well, we need to help the protesters get a voice that's focal as well, and the system's going to be friendlier if we create a more sharper focal voice for those protesters. I mean, not to stop the protesting, okay, but you'll probably end up with fewer of those who are in their frustration and anger committing violent acts if they can also hear, hey, wait a minute, these community leaders are allowing us to come into their place, have a safe place, and listen to them and start kind of working towards solutions. That's my input.
I'm just going to quickly say, I think we need to link them. I think that's the same thing is coming up for COVID and its disparities and inequities. So if we link those two main issues, it's health, it's race, it's economic, those are linked. It's not by mistake that those are raised up for particular communities. It is the COVID epidemic is impacting one community strongly because of the other issue of disparities and inequities. So if we link those two, I think I think the solutions will be very, very similar.
Yeah, again, those two things cannot be disconnected. They are deeply related or impacting each other. We also saw an increase of COVID-19 cases after these protests, right? So we also know that it was the first of the month, 2 days ago, a day where that increased housing instabilities disproportionately for communities of color. We know that youth are impacted by that, whether it's the economic stress of being housing unstable, whether it's experiencing eviction, whether it's experiencing housing instability, right? So these issues are directly related. If you look across the board, LGBTQ youth are disproportionately represented in that process of housing instability. LGBTQ Black youth are overrepresented in this experience as well. And so when we respond, we have to understand the inextricable connections of all of these different systems and forces. And in our responses, we must highlight equity and be holistic because currently the way that we're responding has resulted in an outcry for our responses to be different. So if that is true, then let's posit ourselves and build on those ideas from communities, the work of communities who have already been successful in so many different ways in keeping themselves safe. How can we work together to promote and maintain that safety? I would encourage you to look at the Cure Violence model as one. We have any credible messenger programming is great and important. There's just centralizing people with lived experience in the process, with people who have the knowledge and resources to be able, the knowledge and passion to guide us in our different responsivity.
Well, thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and I believe that Dr. Lopez is going to be coming back on, but I just really wanted to highlight that the power of what has been discussed today, really centralizing relationship, respect, respect for community, honesty about what we're not doing well, really taking, being willing to look foolish. I love that. I'm going to practice looking foolish even more often. And even just the sort of space that was created today, being able to take that forward into our systems and keep our eye on the system and not the kids. It's really important for us to just continue that dialogue, because when you start talking about the kids and families, which really we didn't today, other than what we need to do for them, we've taken our eye off really the problem. And I also love that, that it's delinquency is a symptom of a much deeper problem. That's just a beautiful thing that I'm going to take forward in my work. So I just wanted to thank everybody and thank all the terrific questions. I think we got to most of them, not all of them, and wanted to see if there's any last word that anybody wanted to share before Dr. Lopez comes back on.
All right. Nina, thank you so much for your nimble moderation of this rich, rich conversation. It was incredible. Thanks to AMORE, to DINA, and to Judge TESKE. You've taught us all so much today, and you did so with love, which is a hard thing to do, and I appreciated it. I want to say a couple of things at risk of betraying my bias towards research. I am, after all, a researcher by training. I really enjoyed how data took a central role in the conversations. Judge TESKE, I am very much a data guru, so thanks for indoctrinating me into that term. I will use it forever. But I think what I would like to say really, in hopes that we can take from this conversation moving forward some progress in the area of research, is that data can be your sword and it can be your shield. Now is the time when we can build data capacity to create this shield and this sword moving forward. And I want to say that much of the conversation today, and this is true of much of the conversation yesterday also, has revolved around the notion of quantitative data, the hard data, the numbers. I want to invite everybody to create a space for qualitative research as well, especially as we talk about healing and other non-linear, as AMORE put, concepts. These things are hard to measure, right, in a quantitative sense, but they can really benefit from rigorous qualitative research. And when we are at a time like this, when things are up in the air and there are no hard data, right? This is where qualitative research can really forge the path forward in a way that helps, right? And not just illustrates, which often is the role that's delegated for that type of approach. Anyways, This was incredibly, incredibly enriching to me. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the audience that has participated actively in the chat room here and with your questions. I'd like very much to invite you to join us on Friday if you haven't already signed up for the sessions that we have this afternoon, tomorrow, and Friday. I'm highlighting Friday because we have two amazing speakers, Michael and Pierre and Professor John Powell. Please do so if you have time. I see that Judge TESKE may have tried to get my attention, so I want to make sure I give him a chance to speak.
No, it's just a question. Who's the artist that's been drawing all this, that's behind the scenes here? Because it is wonderful, it's amazing, and very skillful.
I couldn't agree with you more. We're very, very happy to have Angelique McAlpine from Drawing Impact join us and bring to life the amazing words that you all have shared with us. We will be compiling all of her amazing work into a big picture book interspersed with issue briefs from the conversations that we've had throughout this forum. So yes, if we could all do a virtual high five to Angelique for her amazing work. Thank you, Angelique, and thanks, Judge TESKE, for bringing attention to that. And with that, I think it's noon. I can't believe we're ending this. I wish we could go on, and I hope to see you for the afternoon sessions today. Thanks again very, very much.
Thank y'all. Take care. Be safe. Be well.
We also want to display our Padlet just to give everybody a sense of what it looks like for future engagement. This is our Padlet. It's our virtual bulletin board. Please feel free to share comments about today's session or to add your contact information, resources. This is where we will add our additional resources that were mentioned in today's panel as we go. So thank you once again for joining, and we hope to see you at additional sessions.